So welcome everybody. Apologies for the delay. There were some technical issues getting into the session. So Sidak Atnakastan, Sidak Stephanie Carroll, Tishu Stas, Lanak Malchina. Stephanie Carroll, I'm an Atna. I'm a citizen of the native village of Clutica along the Copper River in Alaska. I'm from the Paint clan, and my dad is the Down of the Sky clan, and my maternal grandparents, from them, I'm of Sicilian descent. So I'm an assistant professor of public health and the associate director for the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona. And I co-founded the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, and with Maui Hudson here, I'm a founding member and chair of the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. So we're also co-chairs of the International Indigenous Data Sovereignty Interest Group here at RDA. I want to acknowledge that I'm sitting on the lands of the Tanapum Nation and the Pascua Yaqui tribe here in Tucson, Arizona. I also want to acknowledge that we were to be on the lands of the indigenous peoples in Costa Rica. And finally, I want to say that I acknowledge all the indigenous peoples and their lands on which you all sit, recognizing that the work for which we gather here today emerges from a commitment from each one of us to acknowledge the power inequities and systemic racism that affect the ways in which we currently govern data. So I call upon you to honor indigenous people's sovereignty and our rights to self-determine our data futures. So on behalf of the International Indigenous Data Sovereignty Interest Group, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, or GIDA, and the Fair Data Maturity Model Working Group, I welcome you to the Implementing the CARE Principles, the Careful Process joint session. So this session will consist of focusing presentations by myself, Maui Hudson, Edith Herzog, and Shelley Stahl, and a series of both large group and potentially breakout discussions. So just a few housekeeping notes. Please, as we're presenting, feel free to put your questions into the chat box. We also ask that now, just as a form of roll call, that you place your name and affiliation as you choose into the chat box now. We will also be actively using the collaborative notes for the session that are available on the events page, and I will also drop those into the chat box right now. At this time, I'm going to let Edith and Shelley just briefly introduce themselves, and then we will go on from there. Shelley, you want to go?
I can. Thank you so much, Stephanie. I'm really, really delighted to be here and support this. We're very excited to be collaborating with the folks who have developed the CARE principles. And as a personal note, I'm just so gratified to have Stephanie's patience as I'm on my own journey to understand what it means for Indigenous peoples to have data sovereignty and understanding what that means. And I'm just really grateful for her guidance and the team's guidance. Thank you.
Thank you. And my name is Edith Herzog, and I am from Europe, originally Hungarian, living in Belgium. I am not a data scientist by original profession. I used to be the member of the European Parliament, where I started with the data legislation and the ICT legislation. And after I finished my term, I ran my small consultancy on the EU subjects, but RDA became a very important voluntary work for me. So everything I do for RDA, I do it because I like the community, and I really enjoyed the scalability and the diversity of the RDA. And I am in the council, second term now, one of the 3 European Council members, and besides I'm a co-chair of the Fair Data Maturity Model Working Group, which was a very important step forward to move from the FAIR principles to the metrics. And I think that our very first huge use case, bigger than just the normal use case, but the cooperation among the RDA working groups with the Indigenous working group and the interest group is a very big pleasure for me. I enjoy the diversity. I enjoy to work with people from all around the world who are fighting for their rights and the rights to their data. So I really stand for you, both politically and on the data side. Very happy to be here. And maybe just to say that we are very sorry that our third co-chair from Australia, Keith Russell, cannot be with us today because of other reasons, but he is really someone also from Australia who is committed, passionate about the job, and we would not be able to do our work. And maybe I see also Max Deckers among the participants, who is our editorial team, and without him, and without his help, Christoph, we would not be able to deliver the job either. Yeah. So thanks very much for being with us, Max. And we are very sorry for Keith. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We are very, very glad to have joined together to work through some of the issues and the opportunities that we have around the care principles. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to share just kind of a grounding presentation on the care principles with you. And then I will take down those slides and share another set of slides where Edith and Shelley will provide some context for their experiences with the FAIR data maturity model, which will lead us then into some discussion around creation of a careful process and however we want to be calling that. And so I'm going to play this from the start. And so welcome again. And just a very, very broad statement about what Indigenous data are. And so Indigenous data are information and knowledge in any format that impacts Indigenous peoples, nations, and communities at the collective and individual levels. This is an extremely broad definition, which includes data about our resources and environment, so land, water, geology, all of those. Data about us as individuals, as people, and then data about us as collectives, as nations and peoples, so our traditional and cultural information. And just a point that, you know, especially today, what we see in this broad definition is thinking through how different sectors can learn from each other. So, you know, how we might think about Earth observations, and how those data have been governed, or how they're missing information, as well as thinking through collections, so actual belongings of Indigenous people and the metadata that are associated with those belongings and systems and the processes that have been put in place over time. So Indigenous data sovereignty is the right of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of these data, deriving from inherent rights, inherent sovereign rights, positioned within the human rights framework, utilizing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as different types of recognition within nation states or treaties, court cases, and really the importance of understanding that in some communities, the way that data are governed, so in some Indigenous communities, the way that data are governed might look like what we think of how mainstream institutions are governing data. They might have policies and practices written out. They might have a specific data steward for the management of all of their data. They will have data policies for services and so forth. But in other communities, what we might expect to see might look different. And so we need to recognize that even in communities where we think that there is not data governance going on, that we have these long held traditions, roles, and responsibilities in community that tell us how data can be shared, who's responsible for those data, what maybe the purpose of those information, or as well as protocols for how those data are cared for and who can have access to them. So the really important part when we're talking about Indigenous data governance is really thinking about how do we enhance data relationships so that we can be supporting tribes to govern their own tribal data in the ways that what they want to, that align with their core values, that align with their objectives and their desires, and that they can use those data to make decisions. But also the importance of these relationships is to influence data stewards. So data stewards elsewhere who are managing tribal data or who are managing Indigenous data in other environments are doing it with Indigenous values as guidance for how to care for those data and steward those data. So there are currently 4 Indigenous data sovereignty specific focused networks in New Zealand, the United States, Australia, and Canada. And we've worked through this the interest group here at RDA for a number of years, actually as a working process to create the care principles, which we'll talk about, which were launched simultaneously with the Global Indigenous Data Alliance a little bit over a year ago. And so our interest in working through the RDA and GIDA is not only to produce guidance materials and assert the rights of Indigenous peoples to control their data, but also to more broadly establish relationships across the globe so that while you see here, we have English settler societies where most of our activity is happening right now, that we have been branching out into Mexico, Central and South America, Asia, and other Pacifica regions. I'm not sure if Maui has joined us and if he wants to start now. Maui, are you here?
I don't see him yet.
He messaged me and said he was coming. So, okay, just keep an eye out and let me know if he comes along. Okay. So the care principles were produced at a session of Indigenous Data Week. And you see us here, we were in Botswana at that time in 2018. So about 2 years ago now. And so the initial review happened because Indigenous leaders, Indigenous scholars, and allied scholars realized that we really needed some sort of minimum guidance, minimum standards for the governance of Indigenous data globally to be applied and to really provide some guidance for how to have those relationships. And so we looked at a number of different sets of data related principles, particularly FAIR and others, and really noted that most of them were addressing the attributes of data themselves and weren't addressing the people and purpose of data, which are fundamental really to Indigenous data and the stewardship of Indigenous data. And so we underscored the needs to have collective benefit and authority to control, for the responsibility for positive relationships, as well as ethics that are grounded in Indigenous communities. And these can be found at GIDA-global.org. And we recently had a paper come out in the Data Science Journal as part of the RDA set there on the care principles. And so when we wrote the principles, we really had in mind that there was a strong need to have a focus on the FAIR principles with the care principles, because we understand and there's a desire for better data for Indigenous peoples. And so generally Indigenous data aren't fair. These data and collections can be hard to find. They can be buried in larger data sets or repository. And that's because they're often mislabeled. There's no proper attribution. They're not searchable. And so it's really important as we understand that every Indigenous community has enormous collections and data, and they're held in all of these other institutions. So in archives, museums, libraries, repositories, and other online data sets. And because the significant information, including individual and community names, proper provenance information are missing. They're not accessible. So they're not fair data for Indigenous peoples. And yes.
Maui did come on now.
Oh, great. Maui, you can go soon. Indigenous peoples and communities also at the same time are largely not the legal rights holders. So there's issues of responsibility and ownership, as well as that incomplete metadata that exists there. And there's also the challenge of, while we have these large volumes of already existing data that aren't fair and aren't care, there's also a huge volume of new data being created. So when we think in terms of applying the care principles with the FAIR principles, we're thinking about, at the same time, how do we go back and be careful and make Indigenous data fair and care retrospectively, right? So with these data that are already existing, and how do we do it moving forward? And so a lot of that is about relationships, and a lot of it is about taking steps to change the policies and the processes of how we do research and how we manage data, and so forth. At this point, I'm going to pause and I'm going to have Maui introduce himself, and if he's ready, he can take the next slides.
Good, everyone. Sorry about being late. My name's Maui Hudson. I'm a member of the Whakatohia Nation here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I am a director at the University of Waikato and have been involved with Te Manara Raunga, the Māori Data Sovereignty Network, and the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and alongside Stephanie and others contributed to the development of the care principles. It's been really interesting to see how they are being adopted and picked up in a number of jurisdictions around the world. And one of the big conversations has actually been about how they can be operationalized and implemented, and that's where we're really thinking about as we move into these this session and thinking about how that comes about. So there's just a few points we'd like to make with the next slides, and one of them is that we've set things up so that care and FAIR can be complementary in terms of sets of principles, but they are independent variables. And I think we're seeing the work that the FAIR been going around the FAIR data maturity and how that's moved along, and then thinking about what happens in terms of care. So as Stephanie's been talking, she's been talking about how that there's Indigenous data sets that aren't findable or accessible. So they don't meet the FAIR criteria, and that they may not meet the care criteria either. And then there's some other data sets which people have been working on around making sure that they're FAIR compliant, but they won't be consistent with the care principles. And then there'll be other ones that are neither, both, or parts of one or the other. Next slide, please. I think the other thing to think about is that care, because it's focused on people and the purpose in terms of use of data sets, feels like it applies across a broader spectrum of the activities. So collective benefit, thinking about the ethics or responsibility might equally apply at the point where you're thinking about what sort of data at the beginning of a research project, and might contribute to co-design processes associated with a project, right through to the data collection, the data stewardship, how it's managed and used within a community, or the applications that are generated from it. And because of that, it feels like it might be a little bit, or we just have to think a little bit more carefully about the different ways in which, or the different criteria that might apply at some of the different stages. Next slide. And the third element which we've been thinking about is in terms of how what sorts of mechanisms might be used to address the principles. So how do we demonstrate that collective benefit comes about from the use of any particular bit of data? And so we've been playing around with different mechanisms that exist, and realizing that often the mechanism will support the realization or the expression of multiple principles at the same time. And the ideas that we'd had here were really primarily around some of the Indigenous focused mechanisms, whether they were tribal codes or tribal guidelines or tribal IRBs. But we know that there's going to be a range of existing mechanisms that can support, that will support the operational implementation of care. But there may also be new things that need to be developed to support that as well. And so those were the three points wanted to make as we lead into discussions. Thanks, Stephanie.
Sure. Okay, at this time, we're going to shift a little bit over to hear more about the FAIR data maturity model and some thoughts about that model as it applies and we move forward with implementing and operationalizing care. So I'm having difficulty speaking and doing at the same time, so being here.
It's me again, and I decided today to do not so much speak about the FAIR data maturity model itself, because we had an independent session on this, and I think that the slides are available of the plenary under our working group. So I decided to take a bit different approach to introduce to you that how the care process and the FAIR process can be better aligned and benefit from each other. And this is what I decided to do today. And Shelley will come later with more the context side. So I will remain more on the process side, that how we can use the process we learned from FAIR to get to the carefulness. And Shelley will come with the content. We can go to the next slide, please. So if I like to go back to year 2012, because that was the year when the FAIR abbreviation was kind of first appearing. So it is 8 years ago, and it took us 8 years to get from the FAIR abbreviation to the FAIR principle in 2016. To arrive to the FAIR data maturity model criteria just now in this year in August. And the between in the red green square, you see that the FAIR abbreviation and the FAIR principles started to live their own life. Many people started to use them. It was a kind of creolization of the FAIR principle. Everybody used it. Everybody used it on the different way and format. And 15 different evaluation methodology has been developed to measure the fairness. Yeah, so the people went to the different direction to use it. It was a domain specific, or it was more a generic use, or more a regional use, but the different people used it on the different ways. And we talked that it's a time to go to look the FAIR principles and find out that what could be a way to harmonize them and find the common sense of it. And it took us from 2016, 2017, from this diversity to come up with the FAIR data maturity model working group in 2018 and get a plan, get a very, very focused plan to be accomplished in 18 months, which was July this year. But altogether, with all this pressure which we had, it took us 8 years. While I'd like to mention that the CARE abbreviation started much, much, much later. And I think I was wrong in my slide, because Botswana was in 2019 and not 2018. Am I right? Was it? Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, so maybe it was just a year ago and I'm just lost 1 year because the COVID-19, confused my time feelings. Yeah, so the CARE abbreviation came up in Botswana in 2019, I guess. So it's a much shorter lifespan yet. And for me, it's what is very, very interesting, that how we can move from the care abbreviation through the care principle, which is I very much liked the Maui blog in the recently, which you send it through, that the care principles now having their more structured way to explain what they are. So we have from the care abbreviation, we got to the care principle in a very short period of time. And the question that how we can get from this time to the care criteria, which is probably very necessary in a certain moment, because machine readability needs a kind of easy tool to use for machines and for people. Yeah. So, and I think that it's very, very important that the time, we do not lose time, that the data from the indigenous people for the indigenous people use and for the entire universal heritage is available and accessible. Because yeah, you are absolutely right, Stephanie, to say that the indigenous people has a right to do it, but in the same time, the indigenous data is part of the universal heritage. And I think we are all proud of it, whatever we belong to, whatever identity we do have on our own. So when I made this picture, you can see that the maximum you can reduce the speed, speed to achieve it, it can be reduced for 4 years. Yeah, I know that it's a very, very strict process, but between 8 years and 4 years, if we could do it in 6 years, it's still a 2 year saving compared to the FAIR. Yeah, so there is a potential saving. If we can shorten the duration, then how? And maybe we think that to use the FAIR data maturity model working method and tailor-made it for the care principles, it could help and partially use some of the elements from the process, how we did it. And the other way to do it is to go hand in hand with FAIR and create a pooling effect, yeah, that do not let the indigenous data left aside and isolated, creating the biased data sets in general. I think it's a very, very important for us. And I think that the 3 is possible, yeah, so all possible. We can go to the next slide. I just shortly like to tell you that my dream that from the care principle, we can get to the careful action where the care criteria and the FAIR criteria are somehow united and easy to use level. On this slide, you see that the FAIR criteria has 17 obligatory elements or mandatory elements, 18 very recommended ones, and 8 which are more just nice to have or it's good to use. I'd like to go to the next slide. So I just want to show you again that what happened in these 18 months, that what were the different steps to do. I'm not stopping here because I think that you all know the RDA working method. But in the green square, I'd like to underline that we had 10 working group webinars. We did it always two times a day to make it available globally for everyone, make it more comfortable than now the plenary is. We made surveys, we made testing, we made reporting, and we made all the data available all the time for everybody else. So it was the way how we did it. We can go to the next slide. And it took 2 years. These 2 years you cannot shorten. Yeah, so these 2 years you cannot shorten. And here are the stages that we spent quite a long time to agree what we are going to do and also what we are not going to do. Yeah, so that we are not going to rewrite the FAIR principles. We do not find it perfect. Yeah, so it could be improved, but we decided to don't bother it about this moment. Yeah, use them as they are. And so the definition of what we are doing and what we are not doing, it was a very, very important step. And I think it's very important also for the care principles in the future. Then we developed and tested all the time. We tried something, yeah, we developed something, then it was tested by many as we could find on the different regions and in the different domains. And then we gathered the recommendations, and the recommendations went through the consultation. So it was a very transparent process, but a kind of pooling. Yeah, it was you could not stop. Yeah, you had to go to the next stage. Yeah, it was a kind of moving wheel. It was, I think, a very interesting exercise. And the editorial team helped us a lot. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. The very important message I'd like to say yet, that one of the big learning for me and for everybody else was that the FAIR principles were widely used, but actually In the beginning, most of the methodology concentrated on the letter F, and we had almost nothing on the letter I. So to find the data, it was far more better achieved than the interoperability part or the reusable part. It's still, there is a bit of imbalance here, but also for the care principle, what I'd like to say here as a message that it's extremely important that you work on all of the letters and do not polish one letter further until you do not progress with other letters. I think that was the learning on the FAIR principles, and I think it's applicable for anything else in RDE and outside. And then I think that I have got one more slide. Yeah, I just wanted to show you that you can find the working group output in this card format of RDA. So if any of you are interested, you can go and see it. And now I'd like to ask Shelley to put it to the context, yeah, to explain maybe the first example how FAIR and CARE move together. Thank you.
I don't think I'm the first example, but I know there's a number of efforts, especially having listened to some of the other webinars that Stephanie and her teammates have put together. But we're going to, I'd like to share with you something that's happening right now. If for those of you who know Wim Hugo, he did a recent presentation on the trust principles, which are targeted towards repositories. And he created a graphic that looks something like this. And this motivated a cluster within the Earth Science Information Partners, where membership is primarily repositories. And they were trying to get their arms around what does it mean to support various principles for their communities, and how could they think about that in a way that was more productive. And I won't go any further into that. If you're interested, I'm happy to take that offline. But they built, they have this construct that they're working through, and Wim motivated them to include, not Wim directly, there was an indirect connection to Wim, motivated that the CARE principles be included in this activity. Plus, you know, we have this working relationship with Stephanie, and I was all about doing that. So that was fantastic. So we have the CARE principles, trust principles for repositories, FAIR principles for data. And the team said, well, we don't really understand CARE very well. Let's start with that. Great. So they started to walk down that path. And luckily, Stephanie was available to help us, because this is not a path. You need to understand the purpose to walk the path. And Stephanie and her team have been doing such a great job in Maui and others to help us understand what this means. And luckily she was available. And so as we were starting to analyze what has been provided already, there was a really clear understanding that started to come out. And keep in mind, we're in the point of view of a repository here. Repositories serve communities. Those communities are made up of researchers. And the value and services provided by a repository completely depends on what that community and those researchers need. And then how you're going to then make that data or other objects, software available to be found and reused and understood by others. So their role is rather, pivotal comes to mind, but it's at an intersection of needs of various groups. And as we were exploring the CARE principles, there were some very important elements that came through. If a repository was enabled to support FAIR, that meant that they could support different communities and their needs through the mechanisms that were in place, different ways of governance, different needs of communities. And we felt that that was a really interesting way of implementing what was needed by CARE, but it's still not enough. There's still more, because FAIR is very machine-oriented, CARE is very people-oriented. So having this guide, having Stephanie with us, helping us understand and looking at the repository as a mechanism of implementation has been really, really enlightening. So we're in the middle. I don't have an outcome to share with you yet. If you're interested in joining the cluster, it is an open cluster. It's not specific to the earth and space sciences because we're walking through these principles. So everyone's welcome to be part of this. But where we are at the moment is there is definitely a tight connection between if you can support the FAIR principles as a repository, you are better positioned to support the CARE principles. So that is my and perhaps Stephanie has more to say because she was with us on the last meeting.
Sorry. I think that I'm super appreciative of Shelley and ESIP. You know, ESIP has been supportive of Indigenous data sovereignty from the start. They had a plenary on it very early, like a plenary presentation on it that I gave very, very early on in our work with RDA and in general, since most of our groups only started 2015 and after. And so I love having the conversations around the implementing trust, care, and FAIR together in the repositories. And I think that, Shelley, sets you up, but also it set me up to have some of the more rich conversations that we'd have here today, is what we're hoping. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip back over to our slides and kind of shift us into having a large group discussion here for now. And so what we did, let me see if I can get my share screen back up. Maui, I don't know if you want to make any comments while I'm doing the tech stuff here.
Sure. Yeah, I think the support has been great, and thinking about the complementarity of the FAIR and CARE, I think that's the people that have been talking to different groups here in New Zealand have seen that as well. And I think we was talking about the sort of, while they're independent variables, they're interdependent, and so you know you can't meet some, as you know Shelley was saying. I thought that was really nice about you can't meet all the elements of care unless things are fair. And some of the challenges which Stephanie had been talking about with communities wanting to get access to data, but not being able to find it within data sets because of the way it's been organized and structured. This becomes a challenge for Indigenous communities to find Indigenous data if it's not properly labeled or classified within systems. So what sorts of infrastructure activities can be done that would make that easier to come about? So there was a couple of questions here as we were thinking about this session around what areas are priorities for developing care. And it was actually really nice to hear from Edith too, talking about needing to do everything, that we might want to start somewhere and then make sure that we work through the other bits as we go along. So if people have got ideas about what makes sense in that regard. And I think the approach to developing criteria for care, it's really nice to see it laid out in such a kind of structured way around how that happened. And I was really taken by the creolization of FAIR, because I can see that beginning now as people in different places are thinking about how they apply it themselves, which I think is probably useful in the sense of having people being thoughtful and innovative about how they can see it being used, and but being able to more quickly get into the process of how those things might be harmonized or how those things might be thought about would be useful. So is it open for questions and comments?
Note also we have our shared document, which is linked in the chat box.
Nicholas has her hand up.
Hi, sorry, I'll put my video on. Hi, from Cape. Sorry, I'm running late. Super interested in care since learning about it not too long ago through Africa Archive, and I was actually just in a call with them about not too actually very closely related questions around language and repositories and you know, those kinds of sensitive data sets that we sort of wish to spend much more time with, you know, bringing out in the right ways. So one of the challenges we've experienced at the University of Cape Town in the data repository is to do just that. And one of the specific questions I have there is that we've experienced that the licensing is one of the sort of crucial questions where one is almost tempted to use restrictive or the more restrictive end of open licenses in order to perform a kind of protective function over the data. So very specifically, for instance, scans of heritage sites, 3D scans of heritage sites. Now, you don't want those to become used in ego shooter video games, but you also don't want to lock them away. And you know, so is the license the appropriate tool to kind of divide between appropriate and inappropriate reuse, or are there other, you know, more useful mechanisms? Sorry for the long-winded comment or question.
Kia ora, Nicholas. That challenge you've been talking about is, I think, one that's been existing for a while, and there's lots of discussions. And I guess one of the challenges around that is that to be able to use a license, you have to have the property in the first place. And lots of times, as I think Stephanie had in the slides, Indigenous communities aren't necessarily the legal owners of information, whether it's traditional knowledge and the time is kind of lapsed, or it's been put together by researchers or institutions, and then they sort of become the assigned owners. We have been working with some colleagues up at NYU that have been working on traditional knowledge labels. And it's a sort of an extra legal mechanism that sits as a digital tag in the metadata, and it can identify provenance and attribution. And so it doesn't have the legal enforceability, so it doesn't have a kind of a legal protection, but it creates a kind of like a tangible connection, which can be then seen on the record as other people come in and look to use the information as it moves into the future. And we've just been trying to think about how we might apply that to other contexts outside traditional knowledge, particularly genetic sequences. You know, sort of in a similar situation, because they you can't necessarily get a intellectual property right over the sequence itself, but they're both used as material for deriving products, which you can then, you know, assert an intellectual property right over. So it might be worthwhile having a look at that. It's certainly one option.
Very, very useful. Thank you so much.
I'll put a link to it in the chat.
One of the things that came up during our work, oh, Varsha, I'm sorry, Varsha. Varsha had her hand up.
Thanks, Shelley. Sorry, I only just put my hand up and my camera's not working today, so apologies for that. I just wanted to ask the question about ownership of data. So I'm not a legal expert, but I think there has been an argument that you can't own data because you can't own facts. So that's part of a key thing of open data and open science. So I just wondered how that fits in with thinking about Indigenous data.
Oh, it's getting hot now. So yeah, I've sort of been thinking about this a little bit, partly because there's the degree to which you can separate out in places the fact aspect, which you would say is data, and then what's generated from it that becomes information, and whether the information that's then created becomes data for the next thing. And I think that's probably, when I'm thinking about, say, a lot of traditional knowledge, is it ends up being a sort of a mix of both. I often say that some of the mātauranga or traditional knowledge that you'll find here in New Zealand is information rich but data poor, because it's sits in a passed down through oral traditions. So you haven't got lots of specific observations, but you've got the logic where the observations have informed the way people understand the environment, and rather than keep maintaining the data about observations that sit within your model, you just remember the bits that sit outside the model. I don't know if that makes any sense. And one of the things that we're moving towards here is trying to develop tools that would collect more of the observational data that sits within the models, so that they can also start being used within machine learning applications or applied alongside other other different types of data sets and collections of data. I think it's interesting, the question around ownership, and I think particularly in the context of data sharing, because we're often thinking about shared interests in data, and that the data itself isn't owned in the sense that it belongs entirely to one group, but you've got a group that has an interest in it. There might be a research group that you're collaborating with that also has the interest in it. And what you're trying to do by asserting an interest in being involved with it is thinking about how you're involved in the appropriate management and use, but also the benefits that might emerge from subsequent uses, and where the line sits in relation to that, I think still has to be worked out. But it's probably something very similar to what people have developed over time in relation to intellectual property, and that there'll be limits around ownership, limits whether those are time bound or whether those are sort of scope, how far away from the original or what the innovation is in relation to the next iteration. And just noting that I'm not a lawyer as well, so this is sort of thinking. I see Christoph put his hand up.
Yes. Well, I think it was a very straightforward question, and I did not really see how you responded to the question. I understand that there are two concepts here. One concept, and I'm not advocating for either of them, I'm just trying to understand. One concept is that there is no ownership in data, and from that, of course, you have a limitation in the way you can control access to the data. And another approach is that says, well, yes, there are rights, control rights, and if you look at the European jurisdiction, from the copyright point of view, data are not fit for ownership, but of course, for example, personal data, then the person, if you have personal data, the person has a right to control the data because they pertain to that person, but that's not grounded on copyright, but it's grounded on personal data protection. And my understanding is that the people who argue for indigenous data sovereignty claim something that what one could, in a way, compare to data, to personal data protection. Possibly they could, but one has to be clear that the one argument is, for openness, and the other argument is for the contrary, it's for control. And you can try to legitimize it, but I think it's important to distinguish the two approaches. And I think the argument becomes more complicated when you look beyond the possible approach, these possible two approaches, and you also question whether the way or the argument by which the sovereignty is claimed and also exerted, whether that's in line with what we commonly understand as the rule of law. And some of the rhetoric I've been hearing around this data sovereignty is for me so fluid that I'm afraid that I'm losing what I usually would claim to be an essential part of the rule of law, which means I have to be able to understand it, and I have to have clear legitimacies built up, and that makes the whole thing for me difficult.
I might wish to come in as a former politician here, yeah, because I think that it's you cannot solve this problem simply with the legislation, yeah. It's a much broader part. It's a culture, yeah. And one of the big learning, for instance, for me from the EOSC symposium was, I give you two examples. That in the EOSC symposium, which is the European Open Science Cloud, that the organizations became the biggest bottleneck, yeah. So the European data laws now allow the free flow of data. Now the open data legislation is also done, but the legislation will not solve the problem that the organizations and the rules of participations in the organizations is much more stricter time to time. Yeah, so actually the organizations are remaining the bottleneck, whatever legislation you introduce. Yeah, so it takes a long time to move, and I think that it takes a lot of level to move. And the other example I'd like to tell you that once we had a discussion between CARE and FAIR, then I argued that CARE is one level of openness because it's a conditionality. Yeah, it says that, okay, if you respect this and that condition, then you can use the data. So for me, this conditionality is equal in a way to be open. Yeah. So if you fulfill some conditions, then you can use the data. And for me, it's a key to open or not. Yeah. So interestingly, we could not agree, but for me, the CARE principle was part of the openness. Yeah. It was because it's conditional. You do not have the right to use it automatically, all the data. Yeah. So for me, this conditionality is equal to openness, and it's not necessarily can be sorted only with the legislation. But others argue that it's not part of the openness, which I can understand. Yeah, so we could not agree, I'd like to say.
I agree with you, Edith, and I thank you for your comment. I think it's really interesting because we often talk about this framework of changing law, policy, ethics, and infrastructure in order to have care across systems, right? And to enact it. And we think of law as being the most difficult part to change. But if you think of it from the GDPR standpoint, you might have a law that may or may not intersect with the principles themselves. But as you so eloquently said, what's going on the ground in organizations and policies and practices and the ethics behind it and the actual infrastructure that supports or does not support the ability to be open on terms that are acceptable to people is really, really important.
Let me just clarify that the fact that data exists and that I possibly have...
Vamos ver se tem mais algum feijão com arroz aí pra gente fazer. Amanhã, daqui a meia hora.
Could folks mute, please? Thank you so much.
I did it, but I might have over muted. So, Christoph, I muted him and he kept talking.
Christoph, you're muted.
Excuse me. Sorry. The fact that I may have control of data, factual control, I'm not talking about a legal thing now. And I'm in a jurisdiction where there's no ownership, no copyright ownership based on copyright for data. Does in no way oblige me to make this data available to anyone. That's up to me. I can keep, I can eat the paper. So it's not, I'm not talking about an obligation to make data available. But if I understand correctly, the idea of the background, of course, for this whole idea, for this concept of indigenous knowledge is that you have a group that claims, and I don't want to question the claim, that claims it's been disenfranchised and that wants to reclaim, wants to get back what has been stolen. That's the basic idea that's behind it. And so an organization or a group, a people's is claiming something, whereas in the legal, from the legal perspective, I've been pertaining to you looking at individuals, and it becomes, and if suddenly a new entity, a nation, claims control rights, whereas at the same time, I don't really know how to handle that nation. I mean, handle how the authority that is claimed by that nation is legitimized. Then I have starting to get to that slippery slope where I say, where's the rule of law? That's my difficulty. I understand the context and I'm sympathetic to it, but looking at it from that theoretic perspective makes it difficult.
I'll just field this, and then I want to give some space for Gabby, who had her hand up for a long time. I do think part of this is a epistemological grounding, and the viewpoints and the lens which you look at things through, like the GDPR, as well as from the legal perspective, has been grounded for so long in specific ways of knowing. And so potentially there are issues around stolen data or wanting to repatriate or rematriate data or collections, but there's also very strong interest in some of these issues that Maui brought up around benefit sharing, who benefits, but also the ability to use data for a nation's own interests and towards its own rights and towards the development and well-being of its own people. And so we could go on and on about identification of who is Indigenous and what rights they have. But I think a lot of that is grounded in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And we also have, the train has left the station. And so it's trying to figure out what the relationship is between repositories at at these granular levels between people and researchers and repositories and Indigenous peoples, because that's changing. We have very many governments who are recognizing that day by day by day, and we need to come up with these mechanisms, right, and tools and processes for being able to do this work. Everything from, there's trainings that people want or going to be required to do to how do you write a deposit slip, what's the role of ownership and intellectual property in repositories, all the way up to how does another government deal with it. And so at this point, I just want to ask Gabby, who had her hand up for a very long time, if she wants to speak.
Thank you. Good morning. Well, good morning in Costa Rica. Yes, I think that is a sovereignty problem, really. Is something to do with the recognition that along history, there has been an inequality on how knowledge has been recognized, has been shared, and who have benefit from knowledge, and who determine what knowledge is and what is not. And I think care comes to say, well, not. Okay, there's a different ways to speak about knowledge, to manage knowledge, and there the communities have to begin to not only to see how they recognize their identity in the knowledge that they produce and how they manage the knowledge, the mixture of knowledges that comes out and in a community, but to recognize that what data is and how data is attached to knowledge. And then what there is where the communities can begin to see what they feel that they can share, what they have to share, and how to reuse even knowledges from other sources. And there, that's why I think that there is where FAIR comes. Okay, then you have to be very strong in care, in the care principles, to be able to go the other step for FAIR, because FAIR is more about share, about reuse, about all that means access to data. But you have to be quite sure on how you do your knowledge to be able to transfer that to data.
Oh, Varsha has her hand up. Okay, can I add an element here? Is that okay?
Please.
As we were exploring the details within that repository conversation that was happening, there was kind of a moment where we're like, oh, we have historical information. So it's the Earth, Space, and Environmental Sciences, and we have 100 or more years of data. And some of that data is information. If you look at our world, look at the United States, Indigenous peoples have footprints, have homes across the United States. So whatever we've captured observationally from the Earth is Indigenous data. And having the care principles lift up these concepts really has broadened our minds on what we actually are looking at. Like, it's a whole new way of saying, oh, we have this information. The Indigenous community may not even realize this data has been captured from their lands or their peoples. We need to make these connections, not only internally with how we see this data and how it can impact their decisions. Think climate change, for instance. Oh my gosh, like that should be obvious. That's a really easy one. And how they can use it for their decision making. And then now, how do we as repositories, and granted, I personally am not a repository owner, but this community is, how do we identify that so that you can find it and make use of it in a way that's really valuable to your decision making? So that's like legacy data. So that conversation was happening. And then Stephanie also helped us to understand that, what if we have a researcher who's very specifically interested in capturing atmospheric measurements or soil measurements from current Indigenous land? And then what is the steps that that they go through to get permission to A, do that, and B, place that data in one of the repositories, domain repositories that would make sense for doing that. And what is that governance that goes into place? So there's almost like two ways of looking at it. And maybe they merge at some point, but it's the fact that we're having this conversation and opening the eyes of a community that didn't see it before is so, I don't know, it's wonderful and challenging and exciting all at the same times. And the mechanisms, the social structures, the legal structures that are in place don't help. They go against it in many ways. And what we need to do, and Edith pointed this out, we have to understand how we adjust those to help communities that need this data managed and protected and used. We need to help those communities do that work. They are at the beginning. They are the ones that you are working for, right? You're not working to make the laws work. You're working to help the communities do what they need to do and should do. So I think our point of view has to adjust. I hope that's helpful.
If I may come back for a moment, we do not speak here or very partially only about the traditional ownership and the traditional property. I think that we are far more talking about find or refind our identities, or the indigenous people identity from the past, which they lost, but it was kept somewhere, as Shelley rightly said. So you cannot describe the identity as an ownership or as a property. It's far more about respect, recognition, sovereignty, in the sense that you refine your own culture, lost culture, or the culture which kept somewhere where are you not aware of these. And I think that we cannot describe it from the European legislation simply with the property rights. I think it's a much bigger cultural opening up in a way. It's a kind of renaissance for me to go through this exercise with the Indigenous Working Group. And I'm coming from the closed society. Hungary is an inland country. We don't have sea. We never went to discover the entire world, etc. So for me, it's a kind of cultural travel and a cultural journey in the same time. So I'm very thankful to work with you guys.
Thank you. We're happy to have you too. I want to circle back. There's a number of people who have their hands raised. I'm going to start with Varsha.
Thanks, Stephanie. I think this is really I'm finding this conversation quite difficult, I'll be really honest, because I feel like, I think the key thing is I really don't want to make sure that people are not reinventing the wheel here. And I'm looking at the care principles, that really nice slide that's up with, and I'm just wondering if we changed, like where it says Indigenous data governance to kind of human data governance. I think I said this yesterday as well. I just, and when we say tribal codes, are these particularly different from other groups of humans around the world? And we say tribal codes, do we mean all tribes across the world have the same codes? Because I would expect there would be some differences there, but for the nature of, these are different groups of people. Think about Edith, what you said in the chat, that the GDPR is individual centric while care is global and community driven. But then again, are we not erasing the fact that within a particular community there might be people that want to do different things with their data? And so are we raising individuals' choices here? And perhaps me saying that, with looking at the individual is just reflective of the fact that I've been born and brought up in the UK in a very individual-centric society, and I've not been brought up in that more holistic community-based society. But then on the flip side, my background is Indian, is Hindu, and there is that still, that's, I'm sort of a bit more aware, I would say, than many of the friends I grew up in terms of thinking about the collective rather than the individual. But I think what we have here is really powerful. I really like the care principles, but I worry that by making them so specific to certain groups of people and not just having this more holistic worldwide view where we can raise up all of the humans in the world. There are many disenfranchised groups. If you look at, I don't know, in the UK, we have, white working class people up in the north who don't have a lot of money, are on the poverty line. those are disenfranchised groups. They wouldn't be able to go to a repository and find data on themselves. They are equally unaware of the data that's been collected on them. So I would really love for this to be something that helps people all across the world, not just selected few people.
So I think that you bring up two really important points. And you'll hear me often argue that we need to remain focused on Indigenous innovation in this space because Indigenous thinking has brought about the care principles. I think we do broadly support the fact that the care principles and the actual people and purpose focus of them are helpful and meaningful for very many peoples and populations. Part of my argument is we need to remain centrally focused on Indigenous innovation in this area in order to benefit everybody because of the ways that we've created the care principles from those Indigenous values and perspectives. And so, you know, we could go on and on about that, but I do think there is extreme benefit. And here in the US, we have data for Black lives. And if you look at they issued something on COVID, and many of the values and tenets that they put forth in that document are extremely similar to some of the arguments that we've made around the care principles and Indigenous data sovereignty. And so you do see that crossover. And so we're not being exclusive as much as we are saying that we would like to continue to use Indigenous ways of knowing and innovation to be able to create new pathways for data governance broadly, globally. And I think one of the things that you brought up speaks a little bit to that, which is this quote unquote possible tension between the individual and the collective. And what you do see in so if you look at confidentiality and consent and issues around that for Indigenous peoples participating in genomics research, some of there's been a recent meta-analysis, and there is almost always concern from the individual when you're talking about those issues for the collective rights. And so if the collective rights aren't addressed, the individual is concerned, and the individual feels that their full rights as an individual are not being addressed. And so this comes from a long history of engagement across different layers, where in many Western societies, we see separation between these layers of the rights of the individual are always in contrast to the rights of the group or something like that. In Indigenous communities, there's more fluid, generally speaking, more fluid intersection and interrelationship among these rights. And I think that we can have some new thinking, like I think here in the US, when we think about how we consent and permission for participation in research studies and future use of those data, some innovations we can make from adhering to Indigenous rights within those processes can also benefit everybody else about how do we make sure that we are thinking through what might be some of these broader concerns of communities, especially as folks have put on the chat, disenfranchised communities. Also, Jennifer notes too strongly that the stark difference between Indigenous and groups is really the sovereignty issue, and really moving forward that we are seeking equity and we are seeking benefits and all of that, but we're really standing the ground from the rights perspective. We have a number of people, we have chat going on. We also have folks like Matthew, who has had his hand raised for a while. Matthew, I don't know if you want to speak.
I'm here, and I apologize if you lose me. I've been having internet problems, so I'll leave my camera off in the hope that makes a more stable connection. Can you hear me okay? Okay, perfect. So I'm with one of the granting agencies in Canada, and we've been developing a new data management policy. And in that policy, which is more or less ready to launch, we state in a number of places that any data resulting from research by or with Indigenous communities needs to be managed in accordance with principles developed by or accepted by those Indigenous communities. And so we've been following the development of the CARE principles very enthusiastically. And we, as you well know, we have some similar principles that by First Nations communities in Canada, the OCAP principles. And one of the questions I wanted to ask is a very practical sort of on the ground, boots on the ground question of how does the broader community around Indigenous data sovereignty, is there a strategy, may not be the right word, but how are we hoping to move forward in engaging the diverse, broad range of communities that in one sense we're going to be looking to develop or implement sort of data management approaches or strategies that many of those communities will be pressed to do because of resources and experience. Some communities have very sophisticated approaches to data already, and hopefully those communities can partner with others. But I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how members of your group are planning to engage or move forward to try to take the CARE principles, adapt them, or identify areas that need to be better supported in Indigenous communities more broadly.
So in part that, you know, we have been thinking about the fact that the CARE principles are at one way trying to create enabling environments for local use. So just like you said, you know, expectations of local agreements around data management plans for particular projects, we see that as probably one of the mechanisms that starts to emerge. I think having the CARE principles in place pushes people, whether that's kind of funders or institutions, into explicitly thinking about what's required in that way. So that there won't be a global ethics expectation, even though, you know, ethics is a part of the CARE, but that's pointing towards the fact that there will be local ethics or local approaches and protocols that need to be factored into data management processes. In terms of the responsibilities of institutions, they'll have to put things in place. I think what we will get over time will be a series of examples which you can use. And those examples might be local examples, or they might be local examples from other countries, where you can see that the mechanisms or the protocols or the processes or the policies which they put in place, you can see how that can be useful in your own area as well.
All right,
maybe,
I know.
Stephanie, maybe I'd like to come in to say that I see, as I said, I see this CARE and FAIR principle merging as an opportunity to reduce the bias data. To include that. So you keep the sovereignty, but to include the data for the data sets for the universal heritage. And I think the other thing I'd like to say that this is the very first try for at least for me to describe the community rights and try to deal with the community rights. But it can be a very useful knowledge for any other kind of communities, not necessarily different nations or different people, but different consumer groups even. Yeah, I work a lot with the energy sector, and I see, for instance, the energy consumers as a special community asking for a special rights on their data connecting to energy, or the same with the telephone users and the traffic management. Yeah, so how long you share your data as a customer is, I think it's just another kind of community. Looking the consumer groups as a communities. So in my view, if we can go ahead with the CARE principle for the Indigenous group, we definitely have a lesson to use for other communities of any other kind. So the novelty here is to move from individual to community the way to look at the things.
Thank you, Edith. I'm going to recognize that we have about 7 minutes left. Vera has her hand up for a while, so would you like to speak?
Hello. I was thinking about the problem, how to make sure something that's somehow an exception can work in crisis situations. Like you mentioned yesterday about how does work governance in this moment with the COVID situation. I'm talking about this because I have experience in safeguardedness of immaterial cultural heritage and cultural diversity. And it's very similar with the care principles, and it's very similar what it's like the point that makes Stephanie, that there is an experience and it's very similar, but it's for more communities, it's for the indigenous communities and for other communities. And what we are seeing in this moment in Latin America is because of COVID, all these rights, all these exceptions don't exist anymore. Like Ecuador, that had a very, very good system of safeguardedness of cultural heritage, just said it doesn't apply in this moment. It doesn't work. All the rights you have in this moment are exceptions, and we can't allow exceptions. They don't say it literally like this, but this are the consequences of decisions they made. There were a lot of rights about festivities, or about traditional healing, and all this is prohibited in this moment. And so we see in Latin America, we see that the exceptions for cultural heritage in this moment, just they say it doesn't matter because we have a crisis. And it's not really just a health problem, it's a power problem. So how to make, or what is your experience in this moment, how make sure that things that somehow seen as an exception can work in extreme situations, are still valid in crisis? Because in my experience, the area I'm working in, we are seeing that everything's gone down very, very, it's frightening. It's really frightening.
Thank you. At this point, I'm going to ask if any of the organizers have any final comments that they'd like to make. Shelley, Edith, Maui.
The one thing to perhaps mention is for the FAIR principles, one of the slides that Edith showed showed you a 2-year span where different groups develop different assessment methodologies to apply to the needs of those communities. And we've talked about what that means, you know, for Canadian and Indigenous groups or other groups worldwide, that there would be an opportunity, I believe, that they could take the CARE principles and consider what it means for their communities. And then the criteria that the Fair Data Maturity Model implemented was a common way to look at all those assessments and compare those results. And you're poised really well to put into place, I'm not sure if you would want to call it this, but a fair maturity model or a CARE maturity model, up to you on how you want to name it. So there should be and could be ways to allow communities to see what matters to them and apply in a way that is more valuable to what their needs are.
The only thing I'd like to say that why the creolization is a very good thing. I think that it creates uncertainty and the new ambiguities. Therefore, the way forward to shorten this period of time, which will be far more difficult for CARE principles because it's a people-centric, it's not a data-centric, it's a people-centric. I think it's a more difficult, but probably an important step ahead. And maybe we can work together, the CARE group and the FAIR group, to generate the moment, yeah? To do not make this process endless, because once it becomes endless, it becomes a deadlock. And when you are in the deadlock, then you will not be able to move. And for me, the very convincing argument when I started to work with the Indigenous Working Group was that if people from 4 continents find something so clearly common ground to work on, then it has to be very universal value. And this made my personal commitment to you guys.
Just quickly adding, I think the the care principles, obviously adding something. What do I want to say? That it's adding something that's needed. So I think there's some kind of deeper concerns with how digital and data infrastructure have been developed and what it does mean in terms of how it helps to consolidate power or shift power around, and the kind of individual privacy mechanisms that are placed in some jurisdictions is in part a way of helping to kind of moderate how that comes about. And these focus around the care principles is also supporting that, but just sort of in a slightly different place within the big system. And so really appreciate the chance to explore what that looks like with everyone. I think there's some great lessons from how FAIR has come about that will be able to accelerate how care can be brought into practice more widely and guide different sorts of activities. So looking forward to what follows from here.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. My dogs have realized it's the end of the session, so you'll hear them whining now in the background too. We're very happy to have you here and to move this discussion forward. And I want to give huge thanks to Maui and Edith and Shelley for generating and moving along the conversation. Thank you very much, and we will see you hopefully in person sometime.
Thanks, bye.
Goodbye.